Hi, everybody. I am Angela Page, the founder of Love Your Rebellion, and welcome to week 2 of Poetry for the People. Today, we will be discussing simile and metaphor. So first, let's talk a little bit about what Poetry for the People is. This is a virtual poetry class and workshop that I am offering for the next few more weeks. We will be going until the first Thursday in May. There is a Zoom meeting for the workshop portion of this class, but I'm also going to be recording each week the instructional portions of the video so that people can watch at their leisure if they could not attend the live Zoom class that we're hosting every Thursday evening at 8 p.m. So you can check the Love Your Rebellion Facebook, or you can go to loveyourrebellion.org to find out more about those classes and what we will be studying in the next few weeks. So in week 1, we discussed imagery. So imagery is creating vivid pictures in the mind of the reader using descriptions. So we covered that in week 1, and there is actually a video out right now that you can check out on the Love Your Rebellion Facebook and YouTube pages that you can interact with and learn a little bit about imagery if you would like to do that before or after you complete this workshop. So you can see my beautiful little background behind me. I'm using Zoom to actually record this as well. So you guys will be able to do both things. You can come to the virtual workshop live with me on Thursday nights, and then you can re-watch this video over and over again in order to get your fill of poetry for the week. I thought this would be a good way for people to focus on something else right now and to bone up on their writing skills and, you know, just to have a little bit of fun. So, and learn something in the meantime. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. I am going to have a little PowerPoint that I am going to have ready for you guys in the comments of the video after I post this. You'll be able to look through the PowerPoint and look at the materials that I've created so that you might be able to get a better understanding of the tools that I'm using to create these workshops and use them over and over again, not just in the video. So let's begin today with simile and metaphor. So first of all, I just want to say this. I know that it seems kind of basic, the concept of simile and metaphor. You may have learned about these types of comparisons from your grade school teachers eons ago, but you know, you may not have ever used them for the purpose of making poetry. So just think about that for a second. There's a difference between, you know, using comparisons in your everyday life and then using them in the poetic form. And we do use them in our everyday life, but we're going to study how to create metaphors and similes that help your reader as they go through your work to better understand what is being communicated. So let's start there. So this week, we will not only review simile and metaphor, but we will also talk about the tropes and traps of creating similes and metaphors. We will also talk about how to avoid those tropes and traps. We're going to read a couple of poems that exemplify the use of both simile and metaphor in their work. And then we're going to use a couple of exercises. There'll be one exercise that you can engage with during the video, and then there'll be an exercise that you can use to complete your work on this concept and throughout the week. So you'll be able to, you know, write all week using these prompts. So simile and metaphor. Similes make comparisons using like or as. So these kinds of things, like I said, are very common. You probably use them in everyday speech when you're trying to compare one thing to the other. And you probably also use metaphors too. So these differ slightly. Simile, you're always going to have a like or an as in the comparison, and in metaphor, you're not. In metaphor, you are only going to have probably the word is. So they're slightly different when it comes to poetry, and that is largely because, you know, you are making two different types of comparisons. With metaphor, you're saying that this is that, and with simile, you're saying this is like that. So it's a little different. And when we get to the discussion portion, where I talk a little bit further about these concepts, we're going to see some works from Kim Adonisio about the differences between these two things, the simile and the metaphor. But overall, they're pretty similar. They just create really nice comparisons. And the point here is to try to communicate to the reader something. So, you know, a lot of times poetry is abstract in the sense that it is trying to communicate a feeling or a thought. And sometimes we need concrete descriptions in order to help people access the true meaning of what you're trying to say. So similes and metaphors do that work for the poet and help the reader to discern what is being communicated. And we'll see that in two poems that we're going to take a look at today. So if you want to review that concept, please just go ahead and rewind the video. You'll be able to, you know, re-listen and to all of these as you go through. Next, we'll talk about some tropes and traps with simile and metaphor. So both of these two things are very, very useful. And like I said, used in everyday speech and everyday language. So they're common. And that means that there can be some problems with them when we use them in poetry. Poetry is not the same thing as your vernacular and usually requires a lot more editing than maybe, you know, something you're gonna say to a friend or a story you're gonna tell to your partner or whatever. So these two things are very common when we read poetry, these two tropes and traps. And so the first one is mixed metaphors. This happens when you have multiple metaphors within the same sentence and there's really no concrete description of anything that's actually happening. So it's unclear what you're comparing when you do that. And I'm going to read an example. And the example that I have is, in the heat of the moment, she turned to ice and danced to the beat of her own drum. So I'm going to say it again so you can hear it again. In the heat of the moment, she turned to ice and danced to the beat of her own drum. We have a few problems here. So firstly, we have three different metaphors all in the same sentence. And let's try to dissect them a little bit. So in the first part, in the heat of the moment. So this is a very common metaphor that people use all the time, meaning like in a moment of passion or in a moment of weakness or whatever that means, you know, just making the decision spur of the moment, a spontaneous thing. Passion overtook me. Sometimes you'll hear people say heat of the moment when referring to that kind of thing. The next part of this is she turned to ice. She turned to ice, and that might mean a few things. You might be thinking like, oh, she became very cold, you know, like emotionally cold, or, you know, she became very aloof. She wanted distance and, you know, wanted to be alone or something like this. And then the last one, dance to the beat of her own drum. So this one might mean like somebody who's unique or does things their own way or something along those lines. But when you put them all together, they really mean nothing. So in the heat of the moment, she turned to ice and danced to the beat of her own drum. If we tried to like translate that into non-metaphorical language, it would not really tell us what's actually happening. So obviously a spontaneous decision is being made in the heat of the moment and someone is becoming aloof and doing things their own way. But we literally don't know physically what's happening here at all. We have no idea. So this makes things very unclear for the reader. It might sound flowery, it might sound pretty, but really it's just not communicating anything except for the metaphors themselves and the meanings of those metaphors, which is not what you want. You want people to understand another thing because you're comparing it to something else. That's the trick. So there's really no comparison being made here at all, if you think about it. It's really just a string of metaphorical language. So mixed metaphors, really, if you have these, you really want to try to figure out what is the thing that you're trying to compare. So what is the thing, the feeling, the person, the place, whatever it is. What is the thing you're trying to compare? And then what is it like? What is it akin to? What is it, you know, is it represented in some other way? So try to figure out what you're trying to represent and then what comparison best communicates how you feel or what you think about that thing or feeling or person or place or what have you. So the next one is cliches. And actually, you probably heard a couple of cliches in the mixed metaphor example. So cliches are things that might have been unique when they were very first said, but now they've become part of vernacular, they become part of common everyday language, and they're really not all that interesting anymore. So if you think about the last comparison that I had, the last example that I had, in the heat of the moment, that's a cliche. We hear that all the time, you know. She turned to ice, maybe not as cliched, but definitely something that you probably heard or seen before. Somebody turning to ice, or the concept of an ice princess or something like this. It's very, very common imagery. Same thing with dance to the beat of her own drum. Dancing to the beat of one's own drum is pretty common when it comes to describing somebody who might be eccentric or unique or something along those lines. So what you really want to do with cliches is to transform them. And we're going to have an exercise that gives you some steps on how to transform a cliche so that it becomes something new and interesting, and not something that's tired and used up. So we do actually have an exercise to help you out with that. So that's good. Again, if you need to go back, please do, but we are going to move forward. So now I'm actually going to screen share with you because I want you guys to be able to see the excerpt that I'm going to be reading. I'm going to read an excerpt from Kim Adonisio's book, Ordinary Genius, and this is a book that is all about craft. Kim Adonisio is my favorite poet. I love her so much. She has great ideas and great writing, and I wanted to share this little excerpt that I have here in order to better communicate the uses of metaphor, how they're used in everyday language, and also how we can think about them so that they become more familiar to us and using them becomes more familiar. So let's try to screen share. Okay, now everyone should see a block text paragraph on their screen, as well as me up in the corner there, probably. So I'm just gonna read this and I want you guys to follow along. And I might add some commentary here and there. So in his Poetics, written in 350 BC, Aristotle says, "The greatest thing by far is to have a command of metaphor. This alone cannot be imparted by another. It is the mark of genius. For to make good metaphors implies an eye for resemblances." So I want you to think about this idea of comparisons. Now I'm adding a comment here. I want you guys to think about this idea of comparisons because this is exactly what she's talking about here. An eye for resemblances, meaning that in one thing you can see another, you know, something that might be more familiar to you or have a greater meaning to you or certain connotation. You know, there's a lot of people who incorporate, you know, similes and metaphors into their everyday language, and it really does help communicate the meaning of something or the feeling of something. So that is what Aristotle is talking about here. So she goes on to say, metaphor from the Greek metaphora, meaning transference, speaks of one thing in terms of another, creating a kind of energy field, what I think of as the shimmer. So to Adonisio, this energy field that's being created by comparing one thing to another, she considers this the shimmer. That's what she calls it. That's her metaphor for it, which is, you know, obviously perfect. So she goes on to say, Blake's "To see a world in a grain of sand" gives us sand, grain, and world simultaneously. Simile does the same thing, only a bit more obviously. To say that a grain of sand is like a world would make the comparison explicit and also change Blake's meaning. So again, this is what I was talking about earlier with metaphor and simile communicating something slightly different. When Blake says to see a world in a grain of sand, he is actually saying that it is inside of it. And to say that a grain of sand is like a world makes a comparison, so you see both things, not the two things in one, if that makes sense. So it's explicit comparison when we use like. It's not that one is better than the other, it just communicates something different. And I bring this up because in the two poems we'll study after this, we will actually see that there is a difference in using like or as versus just metaphor, no like or as comparisons. There is a difference there. You'll see that in the two pieces we read. One will have only metaphor and the other will have only simile. So we'll get to that in a second. Let's continue on here. Every time we speak or write, we are drenched in metaphor. I said drenched, but I might have used any number of words to describe the fact that language itself is metaphorical, right? I mean, we say things like that all the time. We are steeped in metaphor, swimming in it, walking through its woods. I learned this from all those Greek and Latin roots that my mother found in the dictionary. The word trivia, for example, from the Latin tri, meaning three, via, meaning way or road. Where roads intersected, travelers would stop to talk and gossip before moving on. So the literal place they met, where the roads crossed, became an image for the kind of conversation that took place there. Now, we don't think about three roads when we say that something is trivia, but the metaphor is there, under the surface, buried. So in other words, if you look up etymology for a lot of English words that have Latin origin, you're going to find that a lot of the syllabic content has specific meaning that may actually carry the meaning of the word, and the word itself is really a metaphor for something else, which is very interesting. So this means that English is actually one of the languages that really lends to metaphor, because a lot of it is built on that. Pretty much any Romance language fits into that category, everything that's Latin based. She goes on here, we use these dead metaphors all the time without realizing it. One day, to say that someone sounds like a broken record may not remind anyone of albums or stereos. At that point, broken record will become a dead metaphor. People will forget about records, but the records will be in the language itself. So this is very similar here. Like, you know, records, they've gotten a little bit more popular again over the last like 15 or 20 years, but a lot of people don't think about an album as a record, and a broken record literally just spins and spins and spins, or hiccups the same part over and over again. So literally the metaphor, you sound like a broken record, comes from the idea of having a record that skips all the time. And even if the records might go out of fashion, we still will have this descriptor, this metaphor that harkens back to it. Do you know where mad as a hatter comes from, or going to hell in a handbasket? I don't. If I had to guess for mad as a hatter, I might think Alice in Wonderland. But when it comes to going to hell in a handbasket, I literally have no idea where that metaphor comes from. And we say it all the time. So this is another example of how our language is just full of metaphors. English is just full of metaphors. Even the word record or record is a metaphor for round black pressed vinyl object. Someone coined, there's another metaphor, the term record or record, because committing something to vinyl was like committing it to paper. So this, again, we record something down in writing, you know, to say, hey, take notes on this, record this. This is the same idea. Music is actually being grooved into the record, right? If you've seen a record, it has those grooves, and the lines inside of it have the music, which is wild. But this is what she means by this, that you're committing it to the record. You're committing the music to the record. The word record or record itself has this etymology. Middle English, literally to recall, from the Anglo-French recorder, from the Latin recordare, from re plus cord, core, heart. Interesting. So to know something by heart is to have it in your memory, and to know it by heart, again, is to have it in a recorded form. So this is really interesting, because you can dig real deep into language and see how much metaphor is really implanted in everything that we do. Every word is connected to other words, to history, to culture, and to how we see. That is a conversation for another time, but again, extremely important to recognize that language has cultural, historical significance, and also frames our perception. So when you come up with a metaphor that's unique, it shows the reader your view of the world. Literally, you're able to create a very unique image that is central to you. This is why you don't want to use cliches. I don't want to use mixed metaphors because either they won't get it or they'll be bored by it and it won't really represent your unique perspective. The lake is a mirror. The guitar is a woman's body. The bird's song, a squeaky door hinge. The raindrops, tiny pushpins hitting the asphalt. So here she is actually showing you the comparisons that might be made for sound or sight or something along these lines. She goes on to say, the essence of poetry, one thing in terms of another. So that's literally all we're doing as poets. We're explaining something and we're saying one thing in terms of another, trying to show the reader one thing by describing something else, which is really an interesting concept to me. And crucially, one thing waking up another. So again, the concepts behind poetry are humanistic. So they deal with things that people are all dealing with: love and death and sex and money and loss and whatever else, right? So it's a humanistic condition type of art, all art form is, right? But the tool of poetry is to wake up those concepts. So death is a universal thing. Love is a universal thing, right? But how we talk about those things is really what makes our voice and our perception unique from the person next to us. And that's the trick here, is to wake up your metaphors in order to communicate your view and your perspective on this. Probably you're familiar with the image of a lake as a mirror. Probably it is no surprise to you that a guitar resembles a woman. But you might have perked up a little bit at the bird's song as a door hinge or the raindrops as pushpins. Maybe you were encouraged ever so slightly toward closer attention. And you might even have noticed how I read the passage, that specific passage. You can see that I go a little more quickly over lake is a mirror, guitar is a woman's body, and then get a little slower at the next one, the bird's song, the squeaky door hinge, the raindrops, tiny pushpins hitting the asphalt, because those two are not common descriptors. I've read the other ones before. I've not read the latter two, if that makes sense. So this is why I'm pointing this out, because this is why certain types of metaphor also contribute to pacing and maybe even having the reader pay even closer attention to what is being said there. So this is the final passage here. Metaphor is perception. Again, what you compare things to communicates how you see the world. This is very important. That's why it's so key to creativity. When we tell ourselves what we see, we can use language that dulls our awareness. Her eyes are dark pools, or language that sharpens it. My eyes, those girls that milk the light. Isn't that way more interesting than her eyes were dark pools? I'm sorry, I don't mean to poke fun or pick at anyone, but if you've got lines like this in your songs or in your writing, you need to change them into lines like this. You need to be changing them into something that is much more like your perception versus something that is vague and maybe not as descriptive. And we might think like, oh, maybe the dark pools, more people will understand that because it's vaguer. You're wrong. I'm sorry to tell you that, but you're wrong. Specificity is how people understand what you're trying to say. And I guarantee that they will understand you the more specific that you get. Those girls that milk the light, we know what that means. We know that when eyes take in light, they are able to see. So we milk the light for the sense of vision. So, just wrap your head around that. The linguist George Lakoff wrote about the ways that the language we use for concepts leads us to understand those concepts differently. This is important too. The way we talk about something is also the way we experience it. Also important. One example he gives is this. I love this example. Argument is war. How is an argument seen as war? Lakoff points out that we use phrases like defending our position or marshaling our defenses. We win or lose arguments. But what if arguments were seen as a dance? Our language would reflect that, and what we mean by argument would change. So you can use language to describe something that maybe isn't necessarily associated with it traditionally to wake up or change the idea of what's being communicated, to give the reader the better feeling, the right descriptions, the right definitions. Again, we rarely notice that we are using metaphor when we say that we defend our position. Most people don't realize that that's what's happening here. This way of speaking is so familiar that the metaphor is effectively dead. So we have tons of dead metaphors in our language. This kind of metaphor is sometimes called dormant or dying, because if we stop to think about it, we can see that a metaphor still exists. It's still there, but you know, it's like so flat at this point that we don't even notice it unless we really, really think about it. So we are going to look at some of Adonesio's exercises, but first let's look at some poems. So let's look at a poem from Ted Kooser. This is the first one we're going to be looking at, and this is called A Spiral Notebook. So this poem exemplifies using simile. So this is using like or as, okay? So let's read it together. A spiral notebook. The bright wire rolls like a porpoise, in and out of the calm blue sea of the cover, or perhaps like a sleeper twisting in and out of his dreams. For it could hold a record of dreams if you wanted to buy it for that, though it seems to be meant for more serious work, with its college-ruled lines and its cover that states in emphatic white letters, 5 subject notebook. It seems a part of growing older It seems a part of growing old is no longer to have 5 subjects, each demanding an equal share of attention, set apart by brown cardboard dividers, but instead to stand in a drugstore and hang on to one subject a little too long, like this notebook you weigh in your hands, passing your fingers over its surfaces as if it were some kind of wonder. That's very interesting. So the first question I'm going to ask you before I define it and give you the answer is, what is this poem about? Stop this video for just a couple of seconds, reread the work, and think about what is actually physically happening in this poem. Tell me what you can really see, or think about what you can really see in this poem. So stop the video for a second and try that. Okay. So now you probably have done what I asked. Maybe you didn't, maybe you want to just hear the answer from me, or maybe it took you a few seconds to come up with your answer. So if we look at this poem, we think about what's actually physically happening. So what's actually physically happening here is there is a person standing in probably a drugstore or some kind of shop, holding a 5 subject notebook and looking at it, thinking about buying it. That is what I see is happening here. That's what I can physically ascertain that is happening inside the poem. But what we really want to focus on here is what is being discussed. So holding the spiral notebook and deciding whether or not to buy it, yes, is part of the poem, but really, what is that description trying to be a metaphor for? Stop the video again, look at the poem, and think about what the comparison is here overall. Not the smaller similes that are inside there that you can see because they use like or as, but what is the overall comparison that's being made here? Stop the video for just a second, think about this, and come back to me, and I'll give you the answer. Okay, so this is about getting older. We actually see, he says it, it seems a part of growing old is no longer to have 5 subjects. So what does that mean? No longer to be in school. You don't need a 5 subject notebook, maybe, if you're not in school, or would you still buy it? And he also says, and hang on to one subject a little too long, like this notebook you weigh in your hands. So in other words, as you get older, maybe you spend more time deciding what to buy. Maybe you're not as impulsive. So I think that communicates the lack of impulsivity that maybe we get as we grow older. We're more impulsive as we're younger. We're less impulsive as we get older. So this is what I think is being communicated here. And so this then this spiral notebook becomes the vehicle, the metaphorical vehicle for this entire poem. So what's happening here is that he actually is using an extended metaphor throughout the poem to talk about the differences in being young and the feeling of growing older. These tiny, small differences, like maybe spending too much time deciding whether or not you're going to buy the 5-subject spiral notebook. And that's a larger comparison. And I suggest you go look up extended metaphor and see how that can play a role in your work. So he's got that. That's the first thing we're looking at here. He's got that extended metaphor happening in this poem. But then there are these smaller comparisons that are made closer to the top. There's some imagery there in the center, but there's a few that are very close to the top. So let's reread that section. The bright wire rolls like a porpoise in and out of the calm blue sea of the cover. So what is this description? This description is probably the spirals, right? The spirals that weave in and out of the notebook and go through the loops. Like I guess he sees like a dolphin or a porpoise sort of jumping as each spiral. That's his comparison. And that's very unique, right? I mean, we can see the spirals on the notebook and we might be able to follow the logic that he's communicating. But this comparison from the wire rolls of the spiral notebook to a porpoise or a dolphin is not common. It's not a dead metaphor. It's something that is unique to his perception. And the second one is, or perhaps like a sleeper twisting in and out of his dreams. So in other words, again, we have another simile here. So we have two, you know, and it communicates two different things. So I would say that the porpoise going in and out of a calm blue sea, that's very peaceful, right? Like think about when you're at the beach. If you live in Southwest Florida, you've probably seen dolphins at the beach. If you have ever seen them come out of the water, it's a very peaceful and serene experience. So the metaphor there really communicates this serenity or this peacefulness that you might find when you see a dolphin jumping out of the water. But the second metaphor, like a sleeper twisting in and out of his dreams, that's not so calming, is it? That's a little more stressful. If somebody is waking up from dreams and twisting and turning, usually there's some kind of turmoil happening and they can't sleep well. So he actually gives you this duality in these first few lines of this very calm perception of the spiral notebook and then this very stressful perception of the spiral notebook. So there is this duality here, this juxtaposition, which we're going to study next week. So if you want to know what that means, come next week or watch the next video. And you can see the balance there, that it could contain something that you could view this notebook as something serene and it can contain lots of beautiful things, or it could be, you know, something that is filled with stressful things like, you know, math, which is stressful for me, or bad dreams, which is mostly stressful for everyone. So Ted actually has a couple of really good things going on in this piece. One is the extended metaphor of the notebook representing, you know, purchasing this notebook representing getting older and becoming more pragmatic and thoughtful. And then also the few tiny little similes that are woven in there that kind of give us the feelings that maybe are being tossed back and forth. There might be like, this could refer to the calmness that you might feel with getting older, but also the stress that it creates. And, you know, maybe the feelings that come up as you grow older. So that is A Spiral Notebook by Ted Kooser. We're going to read one more example, a little shorter, by Kim Adonisio, and it's a little different from this one. So this is called You. It's by Kim Adonisio. This poem is from her collection called Lucifer at the Starlight, and I highly recommend it. I love it. So let's read this together. You. You were a town with one payphone and someone else was using it. You were an ATM temporarily unable to dispense cash. You were an outdated link and the server was down. You were invisible to the naked eye, You were the 2 insect parts per million allowed in peanut butter. You were a car wash that left me as dirty as when I pulled in. You were 20 rotting bags of rice in the hold of a cargo plane sitting on the runway in a drought-riddled country. You were 1 job opening for 200 applicants and you paid a minimum wage. You were grateful for my submission, but you just couldn't use it. You weren't a preferred provider. You weren't giving any refunds. You weren't available for comment. Your grave wasn't marked, so I wandered the ceremony for, your grave wasn't marked, so I wandered the cemetery for hours, part of the grass, part of the crumbling stones. This one is interesting, right? And I think the main difference here is that there's no overarching narrative. In Ted Koozer's poem, A Spiral Notebook, you actually can feel or see a narrative. So when I ask the question, what is actually happening in this poem, it may be a little bit harder to ascertain that. So I'm just gonna come out and give you the answer to it. Clearly there was some kind of relationship here. I would guess that it was probably a lover or some kind of romantic partner, but it could be another kind of relationship. It could be a friend, it could be a parent. I mean, really, there's no conclusion in this poem as to who you is, right? So when I use that phrase, what's actually happening in this poem, it's a little bit harder to discern that. But we do know one thing. We know that there is a you that the speaker is referring to, which means that this is about someone, right? And really what we want to know here is, what is the author or the speaker trying to communicate about you? What is each of these metaphors telling us about you? So I want you to take a couple seconds and just think about that. You can stop the video and reread the poem again and just think about, what is the speaker trying to communicate about you? What do these metaphors have in common with each other? What do they have in common with each other? Just stop the video for a second, think about that. All right, so you may have determined that most likely this is a relationship that went sour. And there's a lot of descriptions to kind of elucidate that. A payphone that can't be accessed, an ATM that doesn't have any money in it, a broken link, let's see, what else? Grateful for my submission, but you just couldn't use it. Weren't giving any refunds, weren't available for comment. So to me, a lot of this means, you know, either a person who was rejected, so you could have rejected the speaker, and we can glean that from some of these metaphors, or the relationship soured in some way. So the thing that guides me to the relationship soured is this line here. You were 20 rotting bags of rice in the hold of a cargo plane sitting on the runway in a drought-riddled country. So in other words, the food had been delivered to the country that needed it, but it is not going anywhere, and it's just molding and rotting. So in other words, maybe these two people had some kind of relationship, and then it went really, really bad because they weren't tending to it. That's a possibility. So here, the metaphors that are in this poem make up a larger metaphor for you. And we could probably, you know, assign qualities maybe to each line of metaphor. So a town with one payphone and someone else was using it, maybe they were emotionally unavailable. They were in love with someone else. An ATM temporarily unable to dispense cash. Once again, someone who's unavailable, someone who can't give you what you need. Someone who you were invisible to the naked eye. Maybe this is someone who can't be reached, someone who is very closed off. You were a job opening for 200 applicants and you paid minimum wage. So in other words, again, this idea of something being very closed or narrow, you only have one very slim thing to fit into, and that's it. What I really want you to take away from this poem is that metaphors on their own, if crafted well enough and they have the right kind of thematic content, could serve as the poem itself. So this is what's happening here, is that really all that's here is a list of metaphors. That's it. There's no action being taken by the speaker. There's no physical descriptions of the surrounding world or any of that. It's just these metaphors that refer to you. But we can kind of glean, once again, how the speaker feels about this person. Why? Because we have all these metaphors that show us that it clearly didn't go well. Like it clearly is either a situation of rejection, you weren't a preferred provider, you weren't giving any refunds, or something going sour after having been there. So all of this combined creates the overall meaning for the poem here. So this is a little bit more advanced, I would think, than maybe some of us have considered when it comes to metaphor. Here you can see that there is no simile present. All that's here is metaphor. And this is different than Ted Kruger's poem, right? Because we can see the spiral notebook, but we can also see the description of the spiral notebook. But with Adonisio's piece, the only thing we have to describe you is the metaphor. There's no physical description of that person at all. There's only the metaphor that we have to hang on to. And that is what really makes the simile different from the metaphor. When you read this poem, you, versus the spiral notebook, you have to use these metaphors to figure out what is actually happening in this poem. Whereas in the other poem, you can actually see the person doing something. So you can physically see this person standing in a store holding a spiral notebook. Not the same thing. So this is just two different ways that these things can be used. So the next thing that we are going to do at this point is our exercises. So if you need to go back and review these, please do. Stop the video and rewind and go over the poetic concepts once again. And if not, let's move into the exercise. So this exercise I would actually like you guys to do while you're watching. So you can pause the video for a little while, and then you can do the exercise and then come back to the video. So this exercise also comes from Adonisio's Ordinary Genius. And this is one of the exercises that she was referring to at the end of that section where we discussed metaphor and how it's embedded into everyday language. And this is a really good one for spicing up old cliches. And I think there's a second slide to this. I believe there is, but either way, Waking the Dead, this exercise says, highlighting some figure of speech we usually pass over can bring it to life in interesting ways. Take the statement, the conversation died. The metaphor here that we usually don't notice is that the conversation is like a living creature. The poem Speck, in the poem Speck, Dean Young focuses on the word died and then creates these lines. It's hard to keep the conversation alive, but no one can find the do not resuscitate order. So this is that metaphor. The conversation died, right? But instead of saying that, Young creates a new version of that old metaphor. So this is one way that you can wake up a dead metaphor. So you can further imagine turns on the dead or dying conversation. The conversation developed terminal cancer. The conversation fell into a coma. The conversation lost its footing and went over a steep cliff. Here's another example. Love stinks. So this is something that we have heard a lot. The implication is that love is something that decays and smells bad, a rotting body, garbage, fumes. Playing with these ideas, you might arrive at the following. So this is probably something Adonisio wrote. Vultures have started circling our love. The factories of love were poisoning the air. I passed a dumpster full of love and held my nose. So again, we have this love stinks metaphor, right? But in these lines, she is transforming this into something that has a vivid description, that isn't something that is cliched or dead, and has a little bit of a better representation. So my favorite one, I think, is vultures have started circling our love. So obviously vultures only eat what's dead, so the love must be dead, right? Below are more metaphors you can wake up. They're either dead, dying, or very tired. Start by trying to capture the equation. There may be not a single correlation. After you get the hang of this, start listing dead metaphors you come across and experiment with. So here is your activity. What I want you to do is take one of the metaphors that you see on this list and transform it into something brand new. So the concept will be the same. So just like in Love Stinks, the idea there is that it's dead and decaying, so you come up with a metaphor that represents that. The same thing would be true for these others. A sudden fear gripped me, night fell, the road snaked into the mountains, music floated out an open window, lights spilled into the room, we hammered out our differences, the party was lethal until someone finally broke the ice, our relationship was a dead end, he threw a tantrum, her face fell. So what I want you to do take maybe 10, 15 minutes is pick one of these metaphors and stop the video and try to reformulate it, communicating the same thing, right? The same idea, but in a brand new way that is specifically from your perception, okay? So just take a few minutes, stop the video, and try that exercise out. All right, so I hope you guys really enjoyed that activity, and I hope that you got something out of it. You know, you can reuse this example activity time and time again, and I suggest you do what Adonisio said, which is when you come across dead metaphors, write them down and then try to experiment with them. Try to find ways to alter the metaphor so it's still communicating maybe the same idea, but is really specific to your perception and how you view the world, your own private metaphor. So this is usually where we do the workshop, and I just want to stop for a few seconds and talk about that. When we do the Zoom call on Thursdays at 8 p.m., we do a poetry workshop. So one of the attendees brings a poem that they would like to receive feedback on from the instructor and the rest of the attendees in the workshop. If this is something you're interested in, you will have to attend the Zoom workshops. Those will not be recorded from week 2 forward, and the video that will be put out recorded is this one, so just the instructional portion. But if you'd like to participate in the workshop, you're definitely gonna have to come at 8 p.m. next Thursday, okay? All right. So you had your first exercise. Now you should try to use this prompt throughout the rest of your week. So this is your prompt for the week based on the things that we just discussed. It's called Rolling Your Own, which is hilarious for me for reasons I won't explain. But Rolling Your Own is the title of the activity. And this is again from Adonisio's Ordinary Genius. The right simile or metaphor can nail a description in a way nothing else can. Call up a second thing in your mind's eye or ear, and the first comes clear. In a harsh poem about a boy killing a dog and throwing it over a falls, Toy de Ricotte describes the decomposing body that finally lay on the bottom like a scraggly rug. Oof, that hurts. There it is, unforgettably, thanks to her simile. So we identify more with the image of the scraggly rug, and we see how horrible that is versus the vivid description of the actual corpse. So your objective for the next week is the following. Carry your journal with you for one day and note only the physical objects you see. Carry your journal with you for one day and note not only the physical objects you can see, but also what they resemble. As your model, you can use the famous 2-line poem by Ezra Pound, In a Station of the Metro, which compares the faces that the poet sees to flower petals. here are 3 examples taken down in the room where I am writing this chapter. So that's very sweet of her to lend her own metaphors, her own descriptions from the place that she is while she was actually writing this excerpt from this book. So rows of pans hanging from kitchen hooks, ducks strung feet first in a Chinese market. So do you see the pattern here? The first line is the actual description. So the first line is the image that you actually see or smell or touch or hear or whatever, 5 senses. Go back to the video on imagery if you need to brush up on that. So the first one is your image, right? The second line is the metaphor. The second line is the comparison that you're making. So there's no other work here other than that. Let's go to the next one. The clock keeps clicking, an obsessive conductor tapping a baton. So that's about sound, right? The first one was sight. The second one is sound. And then this next one, laughter from the house next door. Horses whinnying in the field while I stand in my stall. So in this metaphor, you've got the image of, this other section of horses in the field playing loudly and whinnying, and her being, in her house or in her stall by herself, right? So this is your objective for the next week. Try to use this rolling your own activity to come up with very specific and vivid descriptions that show the reader your perception of the world around you. That is the goal with similes and metaphors. So next week, we will be talking about juxtaposition. This class will be 4/23 at 8 p.m. So if you're watching the video and not attending the Zoom class, it's actually going to be this week. This next class is this week, this Thursday, 4/23 at 8 p.m. So if you'd like to attend the Zoom class, which includes the workshop, you can do that. You can find the event on Facebook, and you can also find a link to it on our website, loveyourrebellion.org. And if you'd like to volunteer to be the week 3 workshop person, please let me know. I would love to have you. So that is it for this week. I am going to stop my screen share if I can. And I am going to just say goodbye really quick to all y'all. So thank you very much for attending. This was LYR's Poetry for the People, week 2, in which we discussed simile and metaphor. Week 1, we talked about imagery, so be sure to check out that video on our Facebook and YouTube channels. And also, please attend the next class, which will be 4/23 at 8 p.m. via Zoom, or you can look for the video that will come out the following week prior to the week 4 class. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for participating. And I hope to see you all soon. Hope everyone's well. Love ya. Bye.